These videos are going to be focusing on arrays, and I'm going to try to use as much example code as possible. I do have the Chapter 8 PowerPoints loaded up. You should be familiar with these, and you should be reading your textbook in Chapter 8 and taking notes. A couple of things that we will use is we will use in C++, it's common to use this constant for a size value. And some other things just to kind of talk about is the subscripts. The value inside these brackets is called a subscript, and the first subscript starts at 0 with arrays. You use the name of the array, then the bracket, and then the subscript, and then you can use your regular assignment statements, you can use output statements, you can use input statements, and you can use those array elements in calculations. This last one is a mistake because the bracket is missing, so it's missing the subscript. And so please look through these PowerPoints. Take a look at the different ways that you can work with arrays. We are going to focus on using the for loop with arrays right now. The reason for that is that generally we do know how many elements are in the loop. We will not usually use what's called a magic number here. 5 is a magic number here, and that means I really don't know what it represents. So we usually use the size variable in that for loop. See if we can find an example of that here quick. This particular slide talks about the difference between using the plus operators inside and outside the brackets. Outside the brackets, it's going to add 1 to this element. Inside, it's actually going to increment, but it has no effect on the actual array. It's incrementing the index, not the array element. The array tasks that you guys are to do in class are, there's several of them that are in your textbook, like copying, testing to see if arrays are equal, summing and averaging arrays. So please look in your textbook for some examples of that. And then strings are actually just an array of characters. So if I have a string city, the city, you can actually pull out each individual character in that string using a brackets, and the 0th is the first character, the first 1 is the second character, etc. Parallel arrays is kind of where I want to start with some examples, because this is where your chips and salsa program kind of picks up. And the idea is that you have different arrays and the indices have corresponding data. So index 0 here will have a name of a person. The average scores for those person will be in index 0 in the average array, and the grade for that person will be in index 0. So these are called parallel arrays. When you process parallel arrays, the for loop that you use, and here's where I was talking about the fact that we're going to use the size of the array in the for loop. And so you will go from a 0 index through size, and this particular code right here just outputs the array to the screen. Notice it's a single cout statement right here. The semicolon doesn't end to down here, but you can write it like this to make it more readable on the screen if you like, rather than having a long line of code on the screen. This is a pretty typical formatting for outputting. So this example declares 3 arrays, and then it uses a loop to output the values in those arrays. Now, it doesn't show how those arrays were filled. So like, for example, right now, theoretically, there's nothing in those values because we didn't see it get filled. You could change this to a cin statement and have a prompt to have the user input data if you'd like to. But parallel arrays all use the same index for the items that are corresponding. Name, average, and grade all correspond to the same, for a person, correspond to the same index value across the 3 arrays. Okay? If I take a look at some code that might use an array, I went ahead and copied, it is program 8.9 from your textbook, and I'm also going to be using a online compiler. The students at Centennial have been using this compiler and they kind of like it. So let me pull that up. It's called an online GDB, and when you first open it up, I would log in with your school Gmail account. You're going to need to select the language, so we are using C++. I just copied over some code from the textbook. It's program 8-9, I believe it is. And yes, program 8-9. if you want to look it up a little bit later in your source code. Okay, and I need to delete a few things out because I have two mains and I have more than 1 pound include, etc. So let me take care of some of this. And this particular program from our textbook sets a constant number for a value for a number of workers, and then it declares the array. And so int hours, number of workers. And so the number of workers is 5, and it's declaring an array that will have hours. And then it has another variable that has pay rate. The loop that they use is a for loop. And so if we take a look, the for loop, you can declare the variable index inside the loop like this, and as long as you only use the index within this particular loop, then you're fine. If you need to use this index value outside of this loop, then you should declare it up here in main, something like this. Okay, so depending upon where you might need to use that variable, you may declare it locally within the for loop, or you can declare it outside the for loop. This example has it inside the for loop. And then this particular program also uses the, when you're outputting the off by 1 index, meaning this, I'm on index 0, but I want to say employee 1. I'm going to go ahead and execute this code and see if it runs on this online compiler. I haven't changed anything, so I'm going to cross my fingers that it runs. And it has some previous code that I probably didn't delete in here. So let me go and delete that, because I copied and pasted it. Let's see if it executes. And so it says enter the hours worked by employee number 1. In order to get employee 1 when it's on index 0, we have to add this 1 right here. And so that's what's happening there. So I'm going to say 3 hours, press enter, 4 hours for the next one, 5, 7, 8, I mean 4, I don't know. And then enter the hourly pay for all the employers. So this one is then, if I do $8.67 for the hourly pay, and I press enter, then it calculates all of what the pay is going to be for all of those employees. So if we take a look, you've got the pay rate is $8.67, so then it calculates what their paycheck is going to be. Okay. So this particular program is ideal for creating another array to work with the employees, because you know that not all employees maybe get paid at $8.67. Like each employee should probably have their own hourly wage. So if we go back and take a look at this, then I'm going to create another array, and that array is going to be double, and it's going to be called, well, actually I'm just going to borrow pay rate. I could just change this into an array, and we're just going to do num of workers. So I'm going to have that number of workers, and this online compiler is pretty nice because it kind of has some IntelliSense built into it, so it's a pretty sweet deal here. So when we go through, I'm going to then copy this for loop, because now I'm going to enter, instead of just the hourly pay for one employee, I'm going to input the hourly pay for all of them. So it's going to be enter the hourly pay for each employee as an example. And my loop doesn't change. It goes from worker up through number of workers. I can reuse this index value here because it's being redeclared and it's restarting at 0. And so that's pretty common. To go ahead and create your variable and declare it here, rather than using or declaring like int worker out here, it is pretty common to just redeclare it inside the loop and declare it and use it on the fly. So then when that loop is done, that variable won't exist anymore. So just keep that in mind, whether you want to use it that way or not. And then we're going to go through and say I'm going to do hourly, no, I want pay rate is now the name of my second array. And it's still going to be worker for my index is fine, because I've got, I'm going for each worker, and that index goes from 0 through less than 5, so the indices will go 0 through 4. And then lastly, it says here's the gross pay for each employee, and so it's going to calculate. Now notice it was calculating the gross pay as it went. Well, instead of, I'm still going to do that, but instead of doing hours bracket worker, I'm going to do times pay rate. It's going to be times pay rate bracket worker as well. So then those two values are getting multiplied, and now I'm using parallel arrays. it should work pretty much the same, unless I have a typo somewhere if we run this. And so I'm just going to, we have it 6 hours, 7 hours, 8, 9, 4, and now the pay rate. So I'll just do something like 10, 11, whoops, they get paid 22. They're a good employee, $34 an hour, 21. And it went ahead and calculated and used those parallel array values. Okay, so that's an example of a parallel array that you can use if you're needing some help on the Chips and Salsa program. I am going to take the same program and we will create functions with it, which is another standard that you need to show. I just also wanted to show here that you always want to have a prompt and then you have your input. So when you're inputting values, it's appropriate to have a prompt and then the input. And notice that they didn't put an end L here, for example. They didn't do end L here because they wanted to keep the value on the same line as the prompt. All right, that's our first video dealing with arrays and also a parallel array example.